Hello, everyone. Welcome to panel 2 of the first day of the In and Out of South Asia, Race, Capitalism, and Mobility conference here at the University of Michigan. I'm Irene Pramod, and my co-organizers are Anisha Padma and Swagat Pani, working within anthropology/anthropology and history. And we're really excited for this panel titled Transregional Placemaking. And we've got some fascinating papers lined up, and with Professor Neha Vora as our faculty discussant. We are aware that on the conference schedule, you may have seen Professor Smriti Srinivas also listed as our second faculty discussant, but unfortunately, due to an emergency, she won't be able to join us. And so, we'll proceed with Professor Neha Vora's comments, and then we'll open it up to the panelists to respond. And then we're hoping for an engaged conversation with all the audience members as well, to kind of engage with the panelists. Absolutely fascinating work. To just perhaps provide a brief rundown of the format, we had made all the panelist presentations available on the conference website, but just to make sure, in case it's helpful, all the panelists will be providing a very brief 5-minute summary of their work before Professor Vora offers her discussant comments, so that we're all on the same page, and so that we can proceed with questions and really engage with what our panelists have to offer us today. So our faculty discussant for this session, this panel, Transregional Placemaking, is Neha Vora. Professor Neha Vora is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Lafayette College, and she works on questions of migration, citizenship, ethno-racial hierarchy, and political economy in the Arabian Peninsula. Her books, Impossible Citizens and Teach for Arabia, relate the socio-political landscapes of the Arabian Peninsula with the everyday lives of its migrant and citizen populations, focusing in particular on the region's large South Asian presence. Her current research further focuses on transnational circulations of Indian labor and the role of diasporic networks in producing possibility as well as precarity. Our panelists today also meditate on similar exciting themes. Tariq Rahman from the University of California, Irvine. His paper is titled There and Back Again, Impossible Citizens, WhatsApp and Brokering Knowledge About Pakistan's Real Estate Market. And our final panelist for today is Nithila Kanagasabai from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. And she'll be presenting her work titled Researching from Afar, the Screen as Sight. So before we actually get into the actual what each of these papers have to offer us, I'll kindly call upon Professor Neha Vora to just provide a very brief kind of mini keynote about how some of the themes in this panel relate to her own work, and just general observations about what this panel is actually speaking to conceptually and empirically. Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Vora.
Great, thank you so much for organizing this and for inviting me. I'm really excited about this group of papers, and of course there's a lot as I was reading them. There's so many similarities and overlaps between the things that I'm interested in and the things that the panelists are interested in. So I really appreciated that, and I learned a lot from the paper. So I think I understood the assignment as talking a little bit about my research and how my research connects to the theme for the panel. So I'll just speak about that briefly. So my research is mostly focused on the middle-class Indian diaspora in the Gulf. I have a book on Indian diasporic, you would call it placemaking, I guess. I just don't use that term, in Dubai. And then I have another book more recently on globalized higher education in American branch campuses in Doha, Qatar, and how different subjectivities are made within the space of the branch campus. I've also started recently focusing on forms of racialization of different national identities in the Gulf, and also on how race, empire, and academic regimes of value structure knowledge production about the Gulf region. So I just want to talk a tiny bit about what transregional placemaking looks like for Indians and other South Asians in the Gulf. And I have just a couple of bullet points, and then I'll turn it over to the presenters. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, because I'm on my laptop. All right, thanks. Okay, so I think many of you have probably encountered ideas of the Gulf as you do your work within different locations in the Indian Ocean, and also how ideas of home and of India, Pakistan, other South Asian countries get reproduced within the context of movement around the Indian Ocean and existences in diasporic spaces. So one of the things that I look at in my work is how the experience of migration, the experience of diaspora might not be terribly different in terms of everyday life for people who live in the Gulf, who are middle class and Indian, but the overall experience is one in which India and the Gulf are not seen as quite so distant. I mean, not just physically, but also in terms of culture, as say like India and the United States. So some of the diasporic literature kind of really creates this like here and there sort of understanding of place, whereas the Gulf was often seen by my interlocutors as an extension of South Asia. You can see so much of South Asia in the Gulf. It's not like there's one little India or little Pakistan or something. They see people are everywhere, and also cultural products are very ubiquitous. South Asian languages, and people are always moving back and forth between the Gulf and South Asia, and I think that creates a slightly more interconnected sense of place between those two areas. You can also see the presence of the Gulf in India in terms of the kinds of social status changes that return migrants can often negotiate, the way that remittances have practically transformed so many different villages and communities in certain parts of India. It used to be mainly people from Kerala and parts of South India that were moving into the Gulf, and now it's moved more into Punjab, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and northeast regions. I also look at how Indians in the Gulf make claims to belonging and non-belonging. So because they do not have access to citizenship or permanent residency, almost all of them are on some kind of renewable temporary work visa, or they're a dependent of somebody who's on a work visa. There's definitely this kind of way that the state, of course, claims that they do not belong legally and does not really pay much attention to other ways that they belong. But it's interesting to see how the first generation also reproduces this kind of claim to non-belonging and like doubling down on the idea of being Indian or Pakistani rather than having some kind of claim to the Gulf, even though their affects and everyday practices do reproduce forms of belonging in the Gulf. Meanwhile, the second generation often sees themselves differently and does make political claims to belonging in the Gulf region. You can also see in the Gulf how diasporic communities both reproduce as well as transcend linguistic, ethnic, religious, class, and caste differences. And you can see that in the way that people socialize with each other, their relationships in the workplace, and also in terms of the reasons for them to migrate, right? Often it is lower caste, poor, and Muslim migrants that are coming from South Asia, and a lot of those decisions to migrate are mitigated by those factors. One of the other things that I look at is how Khaliji or Gulf citizen identity is constantly being made in relation to and against the figure of the Indian other. But I think about Indianness in my more recent work not as something that is a nationality, right? But also as a racial category that may or may not contain Indians, and it may or may not contain other people too, right? It's a way that differential labor is reproduced in the Gulf. And so looking at the Gulf through the framework of racial capitalism and also looking at labor and employment practices as in the Gulf as one node of more transnational networks is something that I really push for in my work. In my more recent work in branch campuses, I look at how what I call local expatriates, which are people who grew up in the Gulf that are not citizens, and nationals reassemble understandings of nation, citizenship, identity, and future through their encounters. And these in turn reflect new ways of thinking about national futures, as well as multicultural pasts. So things like experiences in the classroom, forms of activism that citizens and non-citizens engage in together at these schools really reconfigures more top-down understandings of how identity works there. And then, of course, one of my overarching themes of my research in general is just that I'm very much interested in the kinds of presumptions, academic, anthropological, and imperial presumptions that go into knowledge production about the region, the kinds of categories that we naturalize in terms of talking about the region, how in many ways the Gulf is steeped in this kind of sense of exceptionalism, that it's exceptionally exploitative, it's exceptionally wealthy, and how does a discourse of exceptionalism kind of hide the more global ways that people participate in the processes that you see taking place in the Gulf? How do people who make knowledge about the Gulf often reproduce statist projects of heritage and citizenship by only looking at citizens as the ones that are like belonging in the Gulf, and non-citizens as somehow just bound by, economic, rational actor sort of choices about why they migrate, and how labor exploitation in particular is really steeped in these Orientalist and nation-bound understandings, and how that prevents us from actually seeing the mechanisms through which labor exploitation takes place. So in all of these, I think it really connects to our topic for today in terms of thinking about this constant mobility across the Indian Ocean and how that has and is participating in ways that people think about themselves, their identities, their relationship to others, home, urban space in the place that they migrate to, and also in terms of how they reconfigure space when they return. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll turn it over to the panelists. Thank you so much.
So now perhaps it would be a good time to turn to those, very brief kind of panelist summaries, for the panelists, brief summaries of your presentations, just so that everyone in this room is on the same page with regard to what your main questions and interests are. And now maybe if we proceed to Tariq, if you could just provide a brief summary of your work before we then move on to the next panelist.
Yeah, sure. And just to echo Pallavi's statement, I'm really happy to be here, and thanks so much to the organizers for putting together this really important and interesting event. I'm really excited for the discussion. So my paper comes out of a broader dissertation project on real estate in Pakistan. And I guess real estate is interesting to me because in Pakistan, it's the most common form of investment. The market is, estimated to be worth around $1 trillion. And at the same time, a lot of what happens in the market is grounded in things like religion and traditional forms of sociality, and even illegality. So in my project, I'm kind of broadly interested in the relationship between real estate's profitability and these other dimensions. So I did about 28 months of fieldwork in the city of Lahore, and I divided that between a real estate developer's office, where land is acquired and sold, a local bureaucrat's office where the state is digitizing Lahore's land records, and then a WhatsApp group where overseas Pakistanis share knowledge about the market. And as you all know, my paper focuses on one of those WhatsApp groups. So yeah, when I was in Lahore, I learned pretty early on that overseas Pakistanis play a huge role in Pakistan's real estate market. Around half of remittances go into real estate, and that accounts for about a quarter of all market activity. And another thing that I learned very quickly was that for overseas Pakistanis, WhatsApp has kind of become this central hub for information about the market. So as I discussed in the paper, overseas Pakistanis are, I mean, really just all over the world. You know, Asia, Europe, North America, Africa, and then, you know, of course, in the Middle East. And so these groups kind of operate 24/7 with people kind of constantly sharing information about different projects, everything from like drone footage and like personal walkthrough videos to newspaper articles and court injunctions and things like that. And so a lot of the scholarship on financial markets focuses on knowledge, or the way that shared understandings about markets, goods, and norms are produced. And so I was really interested in how knowledge got created under these circumstances where you have so many different people kind of sharing information all the time. But over time, I realized that in these groups, consensus is rarely reached. As social media goes, the discussions usually descend into bitter debates and people kind of just end up going their separate ways. And so that got me thinking about how maybe it wasn't knowledge, but actually ignorance through which profits get created. And if that's right, I feel like it has some important implications for the way that we think about finance and financial markets. So there's a kind of a long-running understanding in economics that you know, markets consist of kind of people kind of all being aware of the same knowledge, and profits coming down to this sort of like evolutionary battle of wits. But what I've kind of learned as I've done more and more research on Pakistan's real estate market is that at least in that case, it's more through things like ignorance, manipulation, and obfuscation that money gets made. And so one of the examples that I talk about in the paper is a project that I call Jade City. And so kind of one of the sticking points in real estate in Pakistan is whether developers actually have the land that they're selling. And so what I looked at with Jade City was this kind of years-long debate around whether or not they had land. And as I mentioned, people were just kind of sharing information back and forth, you know, photos and rumors and newspaper articles and things like that. And, you know, kind of what ended up happening with Jade City is that there was really no consensus created about whether or not they had the land. And that led to a situation where on the one hand, you had this really popular investment, you know, tens of thousands of investors. And on the other hand, you had like pretty low prices. I mean, around, you know, a quarter to a fifth of what an investment like that would cost. And so it kind of started to realize how it's that obfuscation, that ignorance, that lack of understanding through which, you know, the types of astronomical profits that you see in the real estate market in Pakistan tend to happen, where if the developer ends up getting the land, you'll, you know, see these kind of 300%, 400%, 500% returns. And if they don't get the land, you know, on the other hand, then the assets become liquid and everyone loses their money. And so, yeah, and I guess the last thing to say about that is that I kind of one thing that I ended up following in that group is how kind of out of this ignorance, people just kind of end up going their own separate ways into their individual networks to make decisions, which is, yeah, kind of the discussion I had around brokers in the paper. Okay, so I'll leave it at that, and really looking forward to everyone's questions and comments. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Tariq. And finally, if we could move to Nithila Kanagasabai's brief summary of a really interesting paper too.
Thanks, Irene. Hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here, and I would like to thank the organizers for curating such an exciting conference. I'd like to thank Professor Vora for her initial comments, and my co-panelists for sharing their fantastic work. I'd like to begin by offering a bit of context for my research and follow it up with a gist of the provocations that I focus on in my paper. So my doctoral work focuses on mapping women's studies as a discipline in the current Indian context. My disciplinary training is in media and cultural studies and women's studies, and that's the lens that I'm bringing to this paper. And to do this, I argue that it is imperative that one considers the discipline, not just as it's practiced in metropolitan cities in India, which is what most of the existing literature on the subject focuses on, but that one needs to consider regional and transnational formulations of this discipline. Now, over the past decade, there's been a massive shift in the composition of those accessing institutionalized women's studies in India, with increasing numbers of people from traditionally disadvantaged locations with respect to class, caste, region, religion, sexuality, etc., entering this field. Now, this has been accompanied by discrepant developments within women's studies in particular and the Indian higher education system at large. Now, women's studies faces increased precarity, especially because of fund cuts by the Indian government. There's also an increased state-mandated focus now on incorporation of foreign educated scholars into Indian universities. And more recently, the government has withdrawn financial support to students from oppressed castes seeking to study social sciences abroad. So I suggest that all of this should be read as parts of a more abstract situation, a term borrowed from Laurent Berlant to describe quote, state of things in which something that would perhaps matter is unfolding amid the usual activity of life, unquote. So my research explores the ways in which knowledge travels by focusing attention on the figure of the Indian doctoral student engaging in feminist knowledge production in American universities. It engages with the ways in which questions articulated and explanations sought are informed by the site of enunciation. How what is asked is determined by where it is asked from. While I had plans to interact with my interlocutors in person when researchers from US universities make their annual summer trip to their homes or fields in India, these meetings did not materialize partly due to the pandemic. And this provided further impetus to work with the question, if the global South, especially India, has for long been studied from afar, given its colonial history, what knowledge can reversing the gaze from a distance produce? And so I adopted what can be described as a patchwork of methods, online interviews, opening up my research field to include online academic conferences, research publications, and social media texts. This was one of the few options I had of studying research practices and cultures in translation between the field in India and the university in the US. I used my experience of researching from afar as a scholar from and of the global South to think through the correlations between our embodied existence and our mediated selves. For my interlocutors, the screen offered a way of keeping in touch with the field. They were constantly straddling worlds, home and away, field and university, past and present via the screen. In exploring the plural mise-en-scène of the screen, I gestured towards the digital placemaking practices of my interlocutors. Now, often the screen is thought to partition that which is on one side of it from that which is on the other. And in contrast, the practice of fieldwork is framed as going to see, especially going to see for oneself. I ask if making the screen the site of fieldwork can resist fixity, holism, uncertainty, and draw attention to the always already fluid, composite, and contested nature of knowledge. Locating myself within an ongoing tradition of feminist troubling of the taken for granted in research, I inquire if unconditionally favoring closeness, transparency, and accessibility is indeed desirable. Accepting the impossibility of closeness and consciously disavowing a lofty vantage point, I settle instead for the flat, two-dimensional image, a thin description, a view from afar that draws attention to the mutability and incompleteness of data, while also opening up questions of what is rendered possible or impossible within research, and how this is related to questions of location within uneven geographies. The global north, as field, is often rendered inaccessible to many of us located elsewhere, in turn disallowing the asking and exploring of certain questions. If the pandemic has forced us to rework our research methods, it has also allowed us to reimagine methods anew. In thinking through the possibilities of studying from afar, it has encouraged us to ask questions that while being deeply cognizant of location, are maybe not circumscribed by it. What if one begins to consider these methods not as ways to continue with research as usual, but as avenues to challenge research as usual? Can these methods allow not merely the recognition of epistemic inequalities, but a way to work with or against them? So these are some of the key points that I'm making in my paper. I look forward to discussing it more in the Q&A session.
Thank you so much for that, Nithila. And we encourage attendees to start thinking of questions that you might want to pose to panelists in a bit, but for now, we'll move to Professor Neha Vora's discussant comments and reflections on these 4 really fascinating papers.
Great. Thank you so much for the introductions to the papers. I think they actually resolved some of the questions that I had as I was reading through them. But I really found this set of papers to be incredibly rich and layered, and I'm really excited to kind of see these projects kind of, I can tell that people are at different stages. It's really nice to kind of see the way that you're thinking about bounding and framing these projects, the kinds of like questions you're asking, the way that they're attuned to the politics of knowledge production and asking questions about how power works there as well. So I'll go in order the way that you all spoke. Okay, so I'll move on to Tariq Rahman's paper. I didn't realize you were at UC Irvine, that's my alma mater. So he's looking at this paper's really interested in terms of looking at 2 things, right? The kind of experiences of diasporic Pakistanis and the way that they engage in trying to produce knowledge around real estate investment in Pakistan and in their practices of real estate investment in Pakistan, especially through the use of WhatsApp and as a way to try and get around what they call broker games, right? Which ultimately ends up being a failed venture. But then on the other hand, there's also this kind of really interesting production of value happening in the buying and selling of these files, which I wasn't 100% sure, but it sounded like futures or something like that, that you can buy and sell the land that the file is supposed to be referencing many times over before it even gets to anybody owning land. So if I'm representing that wrong, just tell me. But it's interesting because you see that also in Dubai, like where a new development project will be announced and it creates this whole secondary market where people are already like buying and selling their stake in that thing before ground's even broken on the project itself. So the kinds of questions I think that came up for me were really kind of to try to get more information about how the experiences of being a diasporic Pakistani, and you start to talk about that a little bit in terms of post 9/11 and the way that Pakistanis started investing much more in real estate because they started feeling more insecure in locations of diaspora. But I wanted to kind of know more about, like, especially, this is just selfishly wanting to know about more of the Gulf experience of Gulf Pakistanis, and how does what is the bridge between their experiences of being diasporic and the kinds of forms of socialization that are happening in these WhatsApp groups and also in person as they move back and forth from Pakistan and talk to each other. What is being produced there? Like, what kinds of sense of self are being made and remade in those kinds of groups and in those kinds of conversations? Because that's also a social, it's a social space too, right? Working out of potential like similarities and differences between people who are in diaspora. And how does that then bridge with this real estate market that that's so interesting that you're unpacking? How are the Gulf returnees and the Gulf migrants, how are they perhaps changing the pattern of value and real estate value in Pakistan through their development? Does becoming an investor somehow also drive desires for migration? Does it intersect in certain ways with their understanding of what it means to be Pakistani or what it means to be overseas Pakistani? Does it change their social status in diasporic communities to actually become an investor? Because it seems like there's more going on than the actual production of knowledge about real estate and trying to get around the brokers. At least to me, when I look at the WhatsApp groups, I feel like there's kind of like posturing about who I am in relation to other people who are also overseas Pakistanis. And I was also wondering how there's how masculinity is also produced and reproduced in those spaces, because my guess is that these are all men, right, in these who are having these conversations and that are your interlocutors. just due to the patterns of migration to the Gulf. Okay, so yeah, those are my main questions. I think it's a really, really fascinating project, and I really like the way that you're connecting the kind of informal regimes of value that take place alongside these like larger development projects in Pakistan with the experiences of diasporic Pakistanis.
Thanks so much. So I'll go ahead and try to respond as best as I can. And I think that these are wonderful questions. And I think a lot of it gets at the lives of overseas Pakistanis themselves, and I think that some of the other presenters might have more to say about this as well. But some of this gets into kind of the benefits, but also limitations of doing research in a WhatsApp group. So WhatsApp is really interesting because conversations can take place that like otherwise wouldn't be able to, right? Like, if you're having an in-person conversation, I mean, it's not really possible to like, bring in all of these, different forms of media and, have these like really nuanced and empirical conversations. But on the other hand, I mean, like as an ethnographer in that space, I was limited in terms of what I could, really learn about in terms of people's families, people's sociality, people's experiences in the Middle East and these other places that people lived in. I mean, I could get at it through interviews and things like that, but like I think like the more layered type of understanding that comes out of your work was I hit limits with that in terms of like digital ethnography. And I'm currently kind of weighing whether it'd be worth it to go do some like in-person field work in one of the two of these locations or not. But nevertheless, there are really interesting forms of sociality that come out of the WhatsApp group. And I'm not sure if they pertain exactly to what you're asking about, but I'm happy to talk about them a little bit. So one interesting thing about these groups is that, I mean, people really do kind of form bonds with each other. I mean, this group that I talked about, it's been around since 2016. The members have been pretty consistent over that period of time. And so these are guys that have, really like formed different types of relationships with each other, both around trust and around mistrust. So a lot of them have kind of screwed one another when it comes to like giving advice on investing in particular projects. But then, others have, kind of come to trust each other when it comes to sharing like certain forms of knowledge and things like that. There's a lot of camaraderie that happens. So sometimes like a group member or the relative will pass away and there'll just be kind of like a day of mourning and no one will even talk about the real estate market. And there's, all like, when holidays like Eid come around, there's a lot of kind of like remembrance and, about like the history of the group itself and appreciation for the group. So there's a lot of kind of camaraderie that comes about. And it really, I think, serves for a lot of these guys as a space for friendship. And also, I think for, I don't know how exactly I'd describe it, but really kind of like getting a little bit of notoriety. So you have like kind of more prominent members that, they become known for sharing certain types of information, and they'll kind of put like a little like tag with their name on it when they share it and stuff like that. And they'll kind of tend to take a lot of pride in kind of being associated with that type of information that's shared and developing a reputation as someone who's kind of reliable for certain types of information and things like that. And so people end up, I think kind of really getting into it in that kind of way from the social side of things. So it does have that that type of resonance. And yeah, this is something that like I think I need to think more about and do more research on, but I think that the question of how those forms of sociality affect people's investment activities is a really interesting one. So like, to what extent are people investing in the real estate market? Because it's kind of just a social thing to do. I talk in the paper about these offices where overseas Pakistanis work as, kind of becoming like real estate hubs in and of themselves, and real estate kind of just being the conversation that's constantly going on. And so, yeah, I think the question about to what extent that really kind of encourages real estate investment and channels real estate investment is a really interesting one. And my inclination is to say that it does, that real estate is, the real estate investment for a lot of these guys, I mean, it is about a lot of things, but I do think that one of those things is kind of this friendship, this sociality and this bonding that happens in the WhatsApp groups, but also, overseas as well. I talked a little bit about that in the paper, but I think there's more to say and there's more to think about on that front. And so, yeah, and I guess I don't want to take up like too much time right now, but I think the other thing that you mentioned about masculinity is really interesting. And so, yeah, as you guessed, I mean, it's all males in the group. But one thing that I learned doing fieldwork in Lahore is that women do also play an important role in these investments. So a lot of times it's men that are out front, meeting with people, signing the documents, exchanging the money and things like that. But, like in my own family, for instance, my aunt is ultimately the one that everyone goes to for advice on real estate investment. And she kind of just has this reputation for having a women's intuition. Hanging out in the real estate developer's office, I would always see, deals kind of about to complete, and then the guy saying, "Okay, but I need to go home and ask my wife," or something like that. And then kind of it ultimately depending on that. So there is that kind of very strong masculine dimension out front. But I do think that women play important roles in ways that aren't always seen, either in these venues or maybe even to an ethnographer who really only has access to certain types of spaces. So that's another thing. I mean, I have these kind of like one-off like interesting examples, but it's something that I really wasn't able to explore in depth. And so that's something else that I kind of need to think about a little more in terms of how to write about it, because it is a very real thing. Yeah, I wanna think a little bit more about like how to engage with that in the project. Thanks so much. I'll leave it there. You said a lot more interesting things. I'll think about it and take some notes and maybe follow up during the Q&A. Thank you.
You're welcome. I think what I was getting at, like with the question about like what's happening in the WhatsApp groups, was like, is knowledge of real estate and like acting as if you are somebody who has knowledge of real estate, how is that functioning as a form of cultural capital or social capital within those spaces, right? Regardless of whether people are actually investing. Because I think there's two questions going on here, right? There's like if you were to go down the line of I'm going to be looking at what's happening in these groups and like doing the discursive analysis of like how, what are people saying, how are they saying it, like what is that telling me about what it means to be a Pakistani overseas person, right? I think it's not the same. It's definitely connected, but it's not the same as like who's investing in the real estate, who's getting scammed, how are they scamming each other, what is the materiality of the real estate market. So I feel like there's some really interesting work that will bridge both of those if you're able to do both within the scope of one project. So hopefully that's helpful. Last but not least, I'm going to talk about Nithila. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Your paper is just like, I feel like this is just these are such great questions to be asking. And I think that it's the way that these questions about like, what does it mean to conduct field research and what presumptions come out of understanding academic location as being in the global north and the field site as being in the global south, and this kind of fetishization of this idea that you have to go away to do field work. And even, I was just talking actually with Andrea Wright, who's a discussant on this panel, on this conference last night, about the kind of like, you know, even the gendered presumptions that are built into this sense of like, oh, I can just uproot myself and like move for a whole year or 2 years and go to a different location, and I should be expected to do that, right? When locations, I mean, our home locations also, but locations might be like infused with violence, or people might have like family obligations and things like that. It's just not, there's a very kind of white male centering that happens through those kinds of presumptions as well. And I really like this kind of question of what reversing the gaze would look like. So I think some of my questions had to do with like what the actual like scope of the project was, and the you know, the kinds of research questions that are driving it. But I got a little bit more of a sense when you said that you're working on mapping women's studies in India, but I do want to kind of hear from you more about like, well, how does this kind of focus on Indian feminist doctoral students help you to, who are in the United States, help you to map women's studies in India? I also really love the way that you start with this kind of, this looking at the pandemic and how the pandemic has kind of made people in the global north, you know, rethink the kinds of presumptions that go into this, like, you know, normative form of field research, and how what you're saying, which is so true, that like global South researchers have had to do these kinds of things because of these visa regimes and you know, resource inequality and not being able to travel so readily as someone who would like, say, an American passport, right? So what would it mean for us to look to global South researchers as, you know, sources of theory, sources of methodology, of pedagogy? I think those are very, very important questions to be asking, especially in this moment, like with, you know, anthropology being just like the amount of like continuing elitism and coloniality that are just so fundamentally, and of course sexism, that are so fundamentally embedded in anthropology. And how much of that has been coming out over the last few years. I think that there's like just so much good fodder here in terms of making an intervention, a much larger intervention as well, into like just questions of knowledge production and questions of discipline and things like that. So I wanted to kind of get a little bit more information about what you're calling thin description, and how you're like, how you're framing that as something that comes out of doing research through things like Skype. Is it possible to have that be a site of thick description as well? And are there also things that masquerade in like normative, through normative field methods as thick description that actually might also be thin description, right? And in your research, like what kinds of, how have the things that you've been learning in your research been revealing that perhaps the way that you're thinking about knowledge production and different categories and topics that you're interested in, and the way that the, you know, American and Western European dominated canons on those topics see them? Like, is there something, what's coming out of your research that may be either overlapping with those kinds of canons or challenging them in terms of having this kind of like reversed gaze? I also want to know a little bit more about how the Western Academy circulates in Indian academia as a site of either critique or value. And yeah, I will leave my questions at that, because this paper to me is like something that is so relevant to so many of us, like anybody who's doing research, because these kinds of questions just still remain, I think, like so pertinent to thinking about higher education and postgraduate studies and things like that. So yeah, I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Professor Vora, for your generative comments and questions. I think you've given me a lot to think with and through. So I'll start off with the scope of this project and the scope of the larger sort of doctoral work that I'm engaged in right now. It started off as as an attempt to understand the discipline in the current moment in India. And I found that a lot of literature on this really focused on only the metropolitan centers in India and how women's studies is developed. And there was a very singular history to this, which I had already challenged in my previous work. So for my MPhil, I looked at how women's studies or gender studies as a discipline functioned in tier 2 cities in India. So I was talking about Tiruchi and Coimbatore, which are small towns in Tamil Nadu, which is where I hail from. And the prevalent discourse around them were that these courses are not theoretical enough, that they don't really, that they betray the primary impulse of women's studies to be this sort of discipline that questions the state, that they align themselves too much with the state and therefore are just replicating those models and so on. But in my research, I found that their formulations of women's studies were very different from metropolitan ideas of feminism, in that they were engaging a lot more organically with, say, questions of caste. They were doing work that, of course, drew support from the state because, I mean, as a discipline, women's studies is largely dependent on funds from the state, and therefore that is an undeniable part of the discipline as it exists in India today. But they were also doing very oppositional work. They were doing work that was centering a narrative from non-metropolitan locations and so on. So with a doctoral work, what I intended to do was look at flows of knowledge rather than really root myself in a particular geographical location. And therefore I said, while there's a lot of material in metropolitan women's studies, what is happening to knowledge production in regions and in India, but also what's happening to transnational movement of these knowledges. And it became for me a sort of important moment to do that, also because of what is happening to higher education in India currently. So it's been about 30 years since the Mandal Commission, and the Mandal Commission really made sure, I mean, that was a basis of reservations across sort of central universities in the country. And 30 years hence, there's been massive inclusion of people belonging to oppressed castes that are classified as scheduled castes and scheduled tribes into the higher education system. But at the same moment, in the past few years, we have had systematics of dismantling of the public higher education system. And this has also come with the impulse to sort of rank universities, to rank scholars, financialization of education that Wendy Brown speaks about, and also the impetus and then the push by the state to include foreign educated scholars in universities, and that would push up their rankings and so on. And more recently, just a couple of days ago, we found out that the state is withdrawing support. This is a scheme called the sort of National Overseas Scholarship Scheme that supports students belonging to SC/ST categories and also landless laborers to pursue education in foreign countries. And they have now stopped giving out these grants for people who want to do history and social sciences. Of course, the right-wing government, and they fear that there will be generation of massive amounts of opposition scholarship, is something that has resulted in this. So as I said, for me, this was a moment of crisis within the discipline, but also within higher education at large, and looking at these flows of knowledge and also blocks, as it were, gave me an entry point to discuss the discipline, but also explore some questions on feminist epistemology and feminist methodology, which is also where some of my interest lies. In terms of your second question about questioning normative ideas of field research, again, I owe a lot of my arguments to feminist critiques of anthropology, which has a really long history, really robust history of critiquing the white man's burden and of sort of masculinist methods of field work. And the pandemic has also, again, I think, catalyzed these conversations around what field work means and who is able to do field work and what is considered rigorous field work, right? Because there are imaginations of rigor that are accessible to very few. So how does one then think about rigor also sociologically and in terms of knowledge inequities and so on? So that was something that also I was interested in. And of course, I'm drawing on John L. Jackson's idea of thin description, but I'm also drawing heavily on clear methods like Jack Halberstam's idea of scavenger methods and approaches, and the need to bring together approaches and methods that seem at odds with each other, the impulse to refuse disciplinary coherence as a means of creating an archive that speaks to the hegemonic archive, as it were. So clear methods is something that I'm drawing on extensively. So one of the other interesting things that I found out in the course of my research is that a lot of my interlocutors were not essentially trained in anthropology or South Asian studies. So these are students that have moved to the US for their doctoral studies. Their earlier degrees in disciplinary training have been in India. So a lot of them were not essentially trained in anthropology or South Asian studies, but in moving from, I mean, they were trained in, say, gender studies or cultural studies and English literature and things of that sort. But in moving from South Asia to the US, they became more legible within departments such as anthropology and South Asian studies. And there were also, of course, reasons of funding and where you would get funding and therefore which schools you were applying to and which departments you were applying to and so on. So that was again something that I think that eventually then led me to the focus on this idea of fieldwork. So it wasn't something that I started out with initially, but due to the processes involved in scholars becoming legible in certain disciplines within the US Academy, fieldwork became such an important component of that. The ability to sort of travel back to the home of field, as it were, and to be able to do this research. And finally, the penultimate question that you had about challenging the canon, I think a lot of that is also happening within scholarship that might not necessarily be in English and that might not necessarily be circulating in the sort of prestigious journals that one hopes to write in. So with my previous research, for instance, I found that a lot of students who were in regional colleges in Tamil Nadu in India were writing in little magazines, for instance. And these were research articles, but they were writing it in the local language and they were writing it in little magazines because they said that they wanted their work to be accessible to the people they were researching about. So, so these people were not essentially literate in English, and therefore making it accessible meant also writing in a language that was accessible to them. But of course, the pressures to publish in nationally or internationally reputed journals is, of course, there because that then contributes to furthering your career and so on and so forth. And finally, your question about Western academia and academy and how it circulates, it is, I think it has for long, I mean, the university has been for long the site where one sort of rehearses one's aspirations. And I mean, a lot of feminist scholars, whether it's Mary John or Lata Mani or Chandra Talpade Mohanty have written about their own journeys westward and what it means to confront your counterpart in America and how that then defines your own identity. But what I was interested in doing is sort of looking, so and then they focus on the politics of arrival, right? So what it means to arrive at the metropolitan shores, as it were, and to then look at who you are and what is the kind of work that you want to do. For me, the interesting part of my project was to look at the politics of departure. So what are the conditions that enable or encourage people to leave the country? What are the sort of absences that one perceives within the higher education system here? What are the aspirations with respect to both class mobility, but also the educational sort of aspirations? And Western academy, and also there's been a shift really from English academy being the metropolitan sort of center for education to US academy becoming that, I mean, post-Cold War and so on. So I trace that in my work. And it has for long been a matter of prestige. But what is happening now, as I said, is that the state is intervening in prioritizing people who are able to access education in countries like the US. And this is happening at a time when finally there has been a massive increase in disadvantaged people's accessing higher education in India. So the timing of it seems all the more important. I hope I have answered some of the questions. You've really given me a lot to think with. And I'm sorry if I'm a little inarticulate. It's about 2:30 a.m. here, so I did my best to answer your.
Well, I mean, that again, like shows you a lot, right? I mean, I think that one of the things that the pandemic has enabled, which I really like, is the fact that, you know, you can give a webinar and people from many different countries and time zones can attend, but then we're always just, you know, making everything in American time zones. I think like even when you were speaking, I'm also kind of wondering how much of that elite space of who counts as an academic, right, in the Indian Academy, and how that's also kind of like it's produced in this kind of transnational elitism of like I even remember the you remember that whole thing with the list of like you know, this Dalit woman who had made a list of like of Indian academics and like kind of like, you know, who are it was basically like a whisper network, right? And how all of these like big name Indian feminists, like Savarna feminists came out and like, you know, defending their men, right? And all of a sudden it's like, we need to do due diligence. It's like, aren't you guys the same people who have been like critiquing the judicial system in India this whole time, right? Like, and all of a sudden you've forgotten that. And I think that to me kind of is, and also a lot of these post-colonial scholars who are mostly Bengali, right, who like circulate as the figures of actually both things, like who's allowed to make theory and also who's you know, engages in bad practices. Oddly enough, it's the same people. I kind of just wonder how much we can think about this as like a more global way that academic elitism is reproduced, right? And even I think of Aiwa Ong and her work on flexible citizenship. It's the flexible citizens that get to come back and forth and like get the like endowed chairs and like and all that kind of stuff. Okay, I will shut up now and I will turn it over to whoever else.
Thank you so much, Professor Vora, for that. This has been so generative, and I mean, we only have around 15 to 17 minutes left, and in this time, it would be lovely to engage with, you know, our audience members. If there are any questions that anyone in the audience has, we already have quite a few really engaging comments and questions, and I really thank Professor Neha for Kadir and Professor Neha, what are you too, for, you know, all these reading suggestions, and there is a point, I'm not sure if I should perhaps read off Professor Kadir's comment, but perhaps one thing that I'm taking away from both, from two of her comments is the first is, you know, moving beyond the kind of racism focused on phenotype to kind of move beyond that to consider the structural bases of racism and how how it works beyond these kind of beyond phenotypical markers. And another one of her comments relates to, if I'm understanding it correctly, you know, these the different various kinds of, you know, imperialisms and empire, the Portuguese, the British, the French, and so forth, and how we might kind of think trans-colonially and trans-imperially to consider how these dynamics work in ways that intersect, but also, you know, perhaps even contradict each other in producing these different phenomena, whether in La Réunion or elsewhere. And there's one particular point from earlier panel in the day where one panelist brought up the concept of translational equivalences across in understanding something like race and anti-Blackness, where you have these different historical areas and geographies, and trying to see how things translate, how seemingly singular concepts translate but carry different valences across these different geographies. It's a productive and useful exercise. So yeah, it's definitely given me a lot to think about. But I don't know if anyone else in the from the audience members, if you'd like to, you can raise your hand perhaps, and we'd be happy to. Or if any of the panelists, actually, it would be wonderful if you'd like to engage with some of the comments that's already there in the chat, particularly, I suppose, President Nilofar's and even some of President Neha Vora's reading suggestions. Yeah, feel free to, and actually, I think I'll stop the recording at this point to maybe make the last 10 minutes a bit more informal, maybe. So I'll do that.